Thanks very much, Jim. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to talk about the impact of the Balkans, and here I mainly mean the Western Balkans. I believe there's a map, jolly good, the appliance of science. The impact of the Western Balkans on the European Union, as well as the impact of the European Union on the Balkans. I'll start with setting the scene as it was in the late 1980s. Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, included all of these countries, apart from Albania, but also including Slovenia, which you see a little corner of up there. It had been a state that was really banged together from different Balkan kingdoms and bits left over from the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the First World War. It consisted of 6 federal republics and 2 other regions. The 6 republics were rather diverse. Slovenia up there, rather ethnically homogeneous, fairly wealthy. Croatia, also relatively wealthy, but with a strong Serbian minority. Unlike Slovenia, Croatia had been largely part of Hungary in the old days. Bosnia, a much more mixed place with a much more mixed history. Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. Montenegro, an ancient kingdom, never quite able to make up its mind about Serbia, whether the relationship was that of Scotland to Britain or Scotland to England. And there are significant differences in how you read that. Macedonia, like Croatia, beautiful place, single dominant ethnicity over a diverse population, largest of those being the ethnic Albanians, but also, like Bosnia, a very poor place. Serbia was a special case. Serbia had 2 autonomous provinces, Kosovo, which was largely inhabited by Albanians, and the Vojvodina up there at the top, which is in fact majority Serb, as is Serbia, but unlike Serbia, it was part of the Habsburg Empire. This was the southern fringes of the old Hungary. It's the area where, among famous denizens, include Albert Einstein's first wife, which was how they met, I'm not quite sure, but there we are. Core Serbia itself enjoyed a certain amount of administrative independence. All of this was inside the communist state structures erected by Tito after the Second World War. A single party system, nationalism very vigorously suppressed, sharing of revenues between the units so as to try and develop the poorer at the expense of the richer. Bordered, of course, also by Albania, which enjoyed the most repressive of all the communist regimes, which was an officially atheist state. I should say that in terms of religion, I'm sure many of you know this, the Serbs are Orthodox, the Croats and Slovenes are Catholic, the Macedonians are Orthodox, but different Orthodox, and the Montenegrins are certainly Orthodox, but exactly which Orthodox, they're still making up their minds. The Albanians vary, although probably the dominant tradition is Sunni Islam. It's not a very fervent Sunni Islam, and this is a kind of rather pluralist region. The other important difference that distinguishes the old Yugoslavia and Albania from the former Eastern Europe is, unlike the countries that Janusz is going to talk about, they were not Soviet-dominated. Yugoslavia broke with Stalin in 1948, Albania some years later. So that's whether that was a crucial determinant of what came after, we can't be sure, but I think it's a fact that needs to be borne in mind. In my view, Yugoslavia need not have broken up. I think that the crucial steps down the path of disintegration were those taken by Slobodan Milosevic and the leadership of Serbia in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And they did this by choosing nationalism and ethnic exclusivism as an electoral tactic to stay in power. I can imagine quite easily an alternative history where Yugoslavia stayed together, where the government of Serbia and the leadership of Slovenia came to a deal on how they would arrange their future state. They would have persuaded all the rest of Yugoslavia. They would have coerced Croatia, I think, to go along with it. Slovenian public opinion and the Slovenian elite, both the communists and the non-communists, were entirely prepared to negotiate a new deal within the Yugoslav Federation. And indeed, they were pressurized by the European Union to do so. It was repeated acts of bad faith by the Serbian leadership, culminating in raiding the federal budget illegally to finance the Serbian army that pushed Slovenia and Croatia into secession. And the crucial shift was between January and December of 1990. This account that I've just given you, I think, is supported very strongly by the evidence. It goes against two favourite other explanations of what happened, one current in Belgrade and one current in Brussels. In Belgrade, you will often hear, with some support from the likes of Lord Carrington, who was one of the early negotiators, that it was the German recognition of Croatia and Slovenia that crucially triggered the conflict, that this pushed the European Union into a corner and caused the breakup. I think this doesn't reflect the facts. That happened in December 1991, a year after the crucial decisions had been taken by the people in the field. Indeed, 6 months after the war had already started. So I don't see how the German recognition of Croatia and Slovenia can actually have started the war that was already going on. In Brussels, and to a certain extent in Rome, I sometimes hear regrets that no deal was done to keep Yugoslavia together. That, in other words, they could have been bribed into sticking together with a promise of early EU membership, of special trade deals, which need not have been delivered on straight away. I think that the Europeans did try. I know they did because I've spoken to officials who were active at the time. But I think that Milosevic had chosen another path. I don't completely exempt Franjo Tudjman, who was the leader of Croatia at the time, from this narrative. It's clear that he too mobilized the forces of ethnic nationalism and unleashed them upon his own citizens and upon the citizens of Bosnia. But the environment that made his emergence possible was created by Milosevic and by Serbia, and Tudjman very nearly lost the crucial elections in Croatia that actually brought him to power in 1991. The second narrative and its consequences are important for me today, although I'll return to the first as well. The Europeans promised a great deal to the Balkans and delivered very little. Jacques Pos, the foreign minister of Luxembourg, famously declared that c'est l'heure de l'Europe, it is the hour of Europe. The Americans, whether willfully or through ignorance, decided that they didn't have a dog in that fight, as James Baker famously said. United Nations forces were deployed with inadequate mandates and unclear rules on how they could use force. The European Union deployed unarmed monitors, the famous ECMM, who were referred to in the region as the ice cream men because they wore white suits, thus resembling Italian ice cream vendors. Meanwhile, refugees started spilling into Western Europe with appalling stories of concentration camps, mass rape, genocide, ethnic cleansing. In my own little corner of northwestern Europe, we took it as an awful warning. It's possibly not too much to say that it helped to spur the Irish peace process into the gear that it gradually arrived in the mid-1990s. Most Europeans who'd witnessed the integration of the European Union and the abolition of war as a factor in forward policy planning found this simply outside their cognitive map. It is true, though it is not an excuse, that European policymakers had plenty else to occupy their thoughts at the time. The Treaty of Maastricht, the creation of a single currency, dealing with German reunification, dealing with the collapse of communism elsewhere in Eastern Europe. But what was also missing, I think, was a realization that pompous declarations by foreign ministers are not a lot of use against aggression, that you have to have coercive force or the credible threat of being able to deploy coercive force in order to back up your words with deeds or the potential for deeds, and that this is necessary for peace. Eventually, the sheer awfulness of the facts on the ground in Bosnia, plus some key shifts of personality in Washington and London and elsewhere, brought NATO into the equation. And in 1995, a settlement was imposed on Bosnia, which, quite frankly, could have been reached in 1992 or 1993 had there been sufficient international will. I'll come back to Bosnia, but Kosovo is next. The Kosovo crisis of 1999 represented the European Union and America coming to the conclusion that the Slovenians and Croatians had come to several years before. that Milosevic was not dealing with them in good faith, and that he was unable to keep agreements that he had come to. Kosovo's autonomy had been rescinded by Milosevic as almost the first act of his political career, right at the very beginning. But the Kosovars' resistance up until 1997, really, was passive and pacifist, led by Ibrahim Rugova, who believed that by following the recommendations of the international officials he met, that he should not resort to violence, that he would then get what he wanted. Well, also, of course, Serbia systematically broke the minimal grudging concessions that they had made at the negotiating table. Militants in Kosovo took up arms. Serbian security forces responded vigorously and viciously. And as you know, NATO countries went to war without a UN mandate, resulting in the imposition of a UN administration in Kosovo, which is now nearing the end of its time in turn. Again, the narrative that I mentioned earlier of the EU failing to intervene in its own backyard became very significant. And Ulrike Gero mentioned this earlier. This was the point at which the German EU presidency in early 1999 established the headline goals and the capability of the European Union to actually deploy troops on the ground. Worth stepping back for a moment to reflect on how this actually came about from the EU perspective. And the need for closer European political cooperation had been long apparent. I've already referred to the pompous declarations of foreign ministers. Starting from the 1995 Treaty of Amsterdam, the EU began to build up the nucleus of what may someday be a European foreign ministry in Brussels, using as its base not the European Commission, which is the main executive body of the European Union, which is what controls the agriculture funds and the trade negotiations which were discussed at such length this morning, but instead using as its base the Secretariat of the European Council, whose purpose originally was simply to prepare the agenda and the minutes for the regular meetings of European ministers. When the Treaty of Amsterdam came into force, which was about the same time as the Kosovo crisis, a new High Representative for European Foreign Policy was appointed, this being Javier Solana, who as Secretary General of NATO had been rather intimately involved with the Kosovo affair. It is worth reflecting that although some theorists of European unity or European integration, the functionalist school, always wanted and expected that this would happen, it was driven by European failure in Bosnia and Kosovo and Croatia. And in a very real sense, I think, Milosevic did more for the integration of European foreign policy than any other individual. The results are visible and were very dramatic in the next Balkan crisis, which was the conflict in Macedonia in 2001. This was a case where the ethnic Albanian population in the sort of western fringe took up arms against the Macedonian government, seeking not actually independence, but a better deal from the Macedonian constitutional setup, a case where the Macedonian constitution had been written without the participation of the country's largest ethnic minority. We now had an effective office within the European Union in the shape of Solana and his staff, which was able to intervene in coordination with the United States, with Jim Pardue. And as a result of the vigorous diplomacy from both Brussels and Washington, the crisis was in fact brokered. A unity government was formed, a substantive list of constitutional amendments were agreed, the rebels laid down their arms. First of all, NATO and then the European Union deployed troops as peacekeepers, which was in fact the European Union's first ever deployment of troops in a military mission. Similarly, Solana has brokered briefly the now disintegrated agreement between Serbia and Montenegro. Montenegro was very keen to secede from the Serbia arrangement in which they had been since 1992. Unlike the other republics, they hadn't declared independence at the time of the original disintegration. Solana encouraged them to find a modus operandi where they could stay together with Serbia under a single sovereignty hat for at least a couple of years. I must say I fundamentally disagreed with Solana on doing this and told him so directly. He's not speaking to me now. But I have to give him credit. He kept Montenegro and Serbia together for 4 years longer than they otherwise would have stayed together, which again, as I say, ties into this European narrative of trying to prevent further disintegration. Similarly, at the moment, we have the European Union very closely engaged with the plans that have been drawn up by former Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari to create the final status for Kosovo, which is basically going to be independent and going to be very soon. And the fact is that the EU now actually has an answer to the question that Henry Kissinger so famously contemptuously asked 30 years ago: what is Europe's phone number? I can tell you it's Brussels 284-6111, which is the private office of Solana. Don't write that down, please. As we've been hearing this morning, Europe is very diverse, and I want to reflect a bit on the actual difficulties for Europe in deploying military force. Some countries are firmly Atlanticist, like Britain, most obviously, Denmark to a certain extent. Many of the Eastern European countries that Janusz will be talking about in a moment. Some countries are within NATO, but favour the EU developing its own use of coercive power, and the French are obviously at the far end of that particular pole, but they have allies as well. Some countries within the EU are traditionally neutral, Ireland being the longest standing member in that position, also Sweden, Finland and Austria, which joined in 1995. Also now, often forgotten, Cyprus and Malta. Obviously, the use of armed forces is often the first visible exertion of sovereignty by a new state. It's a very sensitive matter. It's not lightly done even by an old state. Reaching the point we're at now, where the EU does in fact have numerous foreign policy missions in the field, in Eurasia and in Africa, it took a great deal of internal discourse. It was a major factor in the failure of the first Irish referendum on the Nice Treaty in 2001. And two other member states, Denmark and Cyprus, are barred by individual peculiar reasons from participating in EU military missions. Even achieving the level of interoperability between the EU and NATO in military missions, which was demanded by the United States and by its closest allies in Europe, was something that became hostage to months of undignified wrangling with Turkey, which is of course a NATO member, but not as yet in the EU. However, despite the sneers from certain quarters, I think that this is a problem that has been overcome. And as a result of the Balkans, we now see an EU that is more able to punch its weight as an international bringer of peace, as well as an international bringer of prosperity. Well, I've talked about the Balkans as the crucible of European foreign policy, and I think that we should look also at the impact of the EU on the region more generally. The EU now has a strategy for this region, which is quite unlike that it has for other areas of conflict, that is, future membership. Countries of the region are progressing at different rates. The burdens of EU membership are very difficult. They're very heavy for a young administration, particularly when you've been independent for only 15 years or so, particularly when the skill sets that are required for implementing the 80,000 words of the EU's acquis communautaire are not really present. Sometimes I hear complaints from the region that they think the EU is being deliberately obtuse. One foreign minister asked me last year if I could explain to him, or if I knew what the difference was between the European Union and the mafia. I said, do tell me. He replied, the mafia will make you an offer that you cannot refuse, and the European Union will make you an offer that you cannot understand. I sympathise. To become a candidate for the European Union, you have to be accepted by the European Council. To be accepted by the European Council, you need a positive write-up, an avis, from the European Commission. To get that write-up, you have to formally apply. To formally apply, you first need to have already under your belt a special agreement, stabilisation and association agreement with the European Union. And to negotiate and sign such an agreement, you need to be a fully sovereign state. The Balkan countries are at different stages right now. Slovenia, of course, actually joined in 2004. Croatia has started its negotiations, but is still will struggle, I think, to finish them, and there's an obstacle in the way I'll come to in a moment. Macedonia has been recognized as a candidate, but has not yet started negotiations. Albania has signed an agreement, but not yet applied. Bosnia is on the point of signing the agreement. So is Montenegro. Serbia is held up in its negotiations because it has failed to satisfy the, I think, quite rightful demands of the International War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague to make decent efforts to arrest those responsible for the atrocities in Bosnia. That is to say, in particular, Ratko Mladic, the general of the Bosnian Serb army, also Radovan Karadzic, who was the leader of the Bosnian Serb Republic during much of the conflict. And Kosovo faces a somewhat different barrier in that it is not actually independent. I think we will see a rather messy solution imposed either through UN mechanisms or through some sort of succession of bilateral agreements between the United States and the EU on one hand and the government of Kosovo on the other over the next few months. But the crucial point, I think, of the European Union's impact on the Balkans is that the behavior of the states has changed. They're no longer playing the 19th century game of territorial aggrandizement. If you look at the map of the Balkans over the 19th century, you will see how Serbia started off just controlling that little bit, and then got down there, and then finally got down there, and then after the First World War got all of that bit as well, apart from a wee bit, which was taken off Bulgaria a few years later. That's no longer the game. The borders we have are the borders we will keep. It is sometimes a complaint that one hears that these are not rational, sensible borders, that they are arbitrarily imposed upon the peoples of the region. And I have to say my sympathy is a bit limited. If you look around Europe to try and find a border that makes sense on historical, ethnic, linguistic and geographical grounds, I think you will have a very short list consisting of the border between England and France. But be that as it may, that's not really an issue anymore, except in some political quarters in Serbia. There is a problem with the level of communication with the EU, with the feeling of commitment towards membership from the European Union member states at the moment, a feeling that the last enlargement went too fast, that they're looking at taking in too many small, poor countries, and it ties into the very poisonous Turkey debate, which isn't on our agenda today, but which I'm happy to tell you about if I'm asked. The attitude in some quarters in the EU reminds me a bit of St. Augustine, who, if you remember, wrote of chastity that he wished to have it, but not yet. And I feel that the EU's attitude towards the membership of the Balkan states is rather similar. The current constitutional impasse, which again was discussed at some length this morning, doesn't help, although I think that if Croatia turns out to be ready in 2009, they will find a way of getting them in, whether or not there is a constitutional treaty in place at that point. But I think that after the initial period of disastrous neglect from 1991 to 1999, neglect and complacency, I think I should say, since that 8-year period, we've had another 8 years now of increasing engagement and development and support from the European Union, even though there is a great deal of hard work that still needs to be done. And this is because the EU has an integrative vision for this part of the world. Its future relations are clear. And the Balkans, as I said earlier, are unfortunately unique in this respect among the world's conflict zones. The European Union doesn't have a decent overarching strategy for its wider neighbourhood, for the whole slew of countries bordering the EU, for all of those people between Casablanca and Vladivostok. Last night, someone asked David Caleo, after his brilliant presentation, about the integrative possibility of the countries of the Middle East. I don't know the answer, but I'm pretty sure it's the right question. Thank you.